At 3 in the morning, the laboratory is silent in a way that feels almost deliberate. Machines hum softly, each one performing a task too small to notice, too precise to question. Fluorescent light pools across a workstation where a single monitor glows against the darkness. On that screen, there is no image, no skeleton, no landscape, only a line of code, a sequence of letters, fragmented, ancient, 10,000 years old. The researcher leans closer, not because the data is unclear, but because it is too clear. The pattern should be familiar. It should fall neatly into the known architecture of human migration. It should align with the genetic signatures that have been mapped, categorized, and repeated across countless ancient remains from the Americas. But it does not. There is no match, not an imperfect match, not a distant cousin, nothing. Instead, the sequence aligns elsewhere, not in Siberia, not in Beringia, not in any population that, according to every accepted model, gave rise to the first Americans. It points across an ocean, toward a lineage that should never have touched these continents. The screen does not flicker, the code does not change. The anomaly remains quiet and immovable, like a truth that refuses to be ignored. For decades, the story had been settled. The first Americans, it was said, came from the north. They crossed a land bridge known as Beringia during the last ice age, moving from Siberia into an empty world. Their descendants spread southward, carrying with them a small set of founding genetic lineages, haplogroups A, B, C, D, and the rarer X. These were the signatures of origin. These were the markers of a single migration, a single beginning. It was a clean story, elegant, complete. And now, it was no longer enough, because somewhere, preserved in bone and time, was a signal that did not belong. Long before the laboratory, before the sequencing machines and sterile gloves, the evidence had been waiting in silence, buried, weathered, unnoticed. In the summer heat of southeastern Washington, along the banks of the Columbia River, a skeleton emerged from the earth, not in ceremony, not in expectation, but in fragments, revealed slowly by erosion and chance. The man who would come to be known as the Ancient One lay where water and sediment had held him for more than 8,000 years. His bones carried the story of a life lived in motion, the strength of his limbs, the asymmetry of muscle attachment, the healed fractures that spoke of injury and survival. He had been struck hard enough to break ribs. He had carried a spear point embedded in his hip, the bone growing around it over time, preserving the angle of impact like a memory that refused to fade. He had endured, he had healed, he had continued. This was not an abstract figure, not a model or a theory. This was a person, a man who stood at the edge of rivers, who hunted, who traveled, who lived within a world we can only partially reconstruct. And yet, even in death, he resisted simple classification. When his skull was first studied, it did not conform neatly to expectation. Its shape suggested affinities that seemed out of place. There were comparisons drawn cautiously at first to populations far removed from North America, Polynesian, even the Ainu of Japan. It was an uncomfortable observation, one that sat uneasily against the established narrative. But morphology can mislead, bone can echo environment as much as ancestry. So the question remained, who was he? It would take decades before the tools existed to answer that question with any certainty. When they did, the process was painstaking. His DNA was degraded, fragmented, overwhelmed by contamination from the soil that had surrounded him for millennia. Extracting even a trace of usable genetic material required methods at the very edge of paleogenomics. And when the result finally emerged, it was, in one sense, reassuring. He was Native American, undeniably so. His lineage traced back through the known branches of the populations that had spread across the Americas. The anomaly of his skull gave way to the clarity of his genome. But the story did not end there, because further south, deep within Brazil, another discovery had already begun to complicate the narrative in ways that no single skeleton could resolve. She was known as Luzia. Her remains were found in a cave system preserved within the ancient landscapes of Lagoa, Santa. She had lived roughly 11,000 years ago, making her one of the oldest known human inhabitants of the Americas. Her skull, when reconstructed, told a story that was both familiar and deeply unsettling. The features did not align with what had come to be expected of early Native Americans. The structure of the face, the proportions, the subtle contours, these suggested something different, something that echoed populations far beyond the Americas, Australasia. It was not a conclusion drawn lightly. The comparison emerged slowly through careful measurement and cautious interpretation. Yet the resemblance persisted, raising questions that could not be easily dismissed. How could a woman who lived in ancient Brazil bear features that seemed to reflect populations from the far side of the world? For a time, Luzia became a symbol of an alternative possibility, a hint that the peopling of the Americas might have been more complex than a single migration across Beringia. That perhaps, Long before the dominant lineages took hold, there had been others. Earlier arrivals, different paths. But evidence requires preservation, and preservation is never guaranteed. In 2018, a fire swept through the museum in Rio de Janeiro where Luzia's remains were housed. Flames consumed centuries of history in a matter of hours. Artifacts, records, irreplaceable pieces of the human past, lost. For a moment, it seemed that Luzia herself had vanished again into silence. Fragments were later recovered. Enough to continue the study, enough to remind us how fragile the evidence truly is. Bone can survive for 10,000 years beneath the earth, only to be erased in a single night. And yet, even as physical traces are lost, something else remains, something more elusive: the genetic record. In the dense isolation of the Amazon rainforest, among populations that had lived for generations with minimal contact beyond their immediate world, researchers began to uncover patterns that did not conform to expectation. Groups such as the Sarui and the Caritiana carried within their genomes a faint signal, small, subtle, easily overlooked, but persistent. It was not a dominant lineage, not a defining feature, only a trace, a whisper within the broader structure of their DNA. And yet, when analyzed, it pointed elsewhere, toward Australasia, not directly, not completely, but enough to suggest a divergence that could not be explained by the standard model, a genetic echo of a population that, according to established theory, should never have been there. The term that emerged for this anomaly was drawn from a Tupi word, Yipicuera, ancestor, population Y. It was, by definition, a ghost, not a fully identified group, not a culture with artifacts or settlements that could be traced and studied, but a presence inferred from absence, a lineage detected not through what it left behind, but through what remained within others, a fragment of ancestry, approximately 1 or 2%, a ripple in the genetic fabric, small enough to ignore, too consistent to dismiss. The discovery did not arrive as a single revelation. It unfolded slowly, cautiously, as if the data itself resisted being understood too quickly. At first, the signal was dismissed as noise, a statistical irregularity, something that would vanish with refinement. Ancient DNA is fragile, and the process of extracting it is imperfect. Contamination is always a concern, a stray fragment from a modern handler, a trace introduced during sequencing. These possibilities linger at the edge of every result, but the signal did not disappear. It persisted across independent analyses. Different laboratories, different methods, each time the same faint alignment appeared, pointing beyond Siberia, beyond Beringia, toward populations separated by vast distances and even greater spans of time. The implications were difficult to accept, because the established model of migration into the Americas was not simply a hypothesis. It had become a framework, a structure upon which decades of archaeological and genetic research had been built. It was in many ways a kind of boundary, a conceptual wall that defined what was possible and what was not. Beringia was that boundary. A land bridge exposed by falling sea levels during the last ice age, connecting Asia to North America. It was through this corridor that the first humans were believed to have entered the continent. A single ancestral population, moving slowly across a frozen landscape, carrying with them the genetic blueprint that would define all subsequent Native American lineages. This model was not without nuance. There were debates about timing, about coastal versus inland routes, about the speed and pattern of dispersal. But the core assumption remained intact. One origin, one migration, one story. Population Y did not fit within that story. If the signal was real, it implied that another group, one with genetic affinities to Australasia, had somehow contributed to the ancestry of certain Native American populations, not as a dominant force, but as a subtle influence, a thread woven into the larger fabric. The question was not simply how, it was when. And perhaps more importantly, why there was so little evidence of it, because migrations leave traces, tools, settlements, burial sites, layers of material culture that can be uncovered, cataloged, and compared. Even the earliest known inhabitants of the Americas left behind evidence of their presence: stone points, hearths, fragments of daily life. But for population Y, there was nothing of the kind. No distinctive tool tradition, no identifiable settlement pattern, no skeletal remains that could be confidently assigned to this lineage alone. It was as if an entire people had passed through the world without leaving a mark, save for the faintest imprint in the genomes of those who came after. This absence created tension within the scientific community. Some researchers argued that the signal must be the result of contamination or statistical artifact, that the resemblance to Australasian populations could arise from deeper shared ancestry rather than a direct migration. Human populations are not isolated entities. They are branches of a vast and interconnected tree. It is possible, they suggested, that the genetic similarity reflected an ancient divergence long before the peopling of the Americas, rather than a separate wave of migration into them. Others were less convinced. They pointed to the specificity of the signal, its restriction to certain Amazonian groups, its absence in northern populations, and in well-studied ancient remains such as the Clovis-associated child found in Montana. If the signal were simply a relic of deep ancestry, it should appear more broadly, but it did not. It was localized, persistent, real. The debate became, in many ways, a quiet conflict between caution and curiosity. On one side, the weight of established knowledge, the desire to protect a model that had proven reliable across multiple lines of evidence. On the other, the recognition that anomalies are not inconveniences to be explained away, but opportunities to refine our understanding. The tension was not dramatic. There were no declarations of revolution, no sudden collapse of existing theory. Instead, there was a gradual shift, a willingness in some quarters to consider that the story might be more complex than previously imagined, that perhaps the first Americans were not a single unified group, but a mosaic of lineages, some dominant, some fleeting, some almost invisible. In this context, the Amazon itself takes on a new significance. It is not merely a location, but a kind of archive, dense, isolated, resistant to change. For thousands of years, the rainforest has acted as a barrier, limiting contact between its inhabitants and the outside world. Populations within it have remained relatively stable, their genetic signatures preserved with minimal external influence. This isolation makes the Amazon a kind of time capsule. Within it, traces of ancient ancestry can persist long after they have been diluted or erased elsewhere. The faint signal of population Y, detected in the genomes of groups like the Surui and Caritiana, may represent a remnant of a much broader presence, one that has otherwise been lost. It is a fragment of a past that has largely disappeared. And it raises a question that is both simple and profound. What happened to them? If a group related to Australasian populations did contribute to the ancestry of early Americans, even in a limited way, they must have existed as a distinct population at some point. They must have traveled, survived, interacted, and ultimately merged with others. They must have had lives, families, languages, traditions. And yet, none of these have survived in a form that we can clearly identify. There are no tools we can confidently assign to them, no settlements that bear their signature, no burial sites that speak exclusively of their presence. Only the genetic trace remains. A small percentage, a statistical echo. It is, in a very real sense, a ghost. To understand the weight of that absence, it is necessary to return once more to the bone. Not the abstract idea of ancestry or the shifting models of migration, but the physical reality of human remains, the places where time slows and where fragments of a life can still be read in silence. The Ancient One lay for more than 8 millennia beneath the soil beside the Columbia River. His bones recorded impact and recovery, labor and repetition, the subtle thickening where muscle once pulled against bone, the healed fractures that marked moments of violence or accident, the quiet evidence of endurance. His life is partially visible. Luzia, in contrast, exists at the edge of visibility. Her skull, reconstructed from fragments, offers a face that seems to belong both here and elsewhere, a form that invites comparison, yet resists certainty. Her story is further obscured by loss, by the fire that reduced so much of her context to ash. Between them, these two individuals frame a question that extends far beyond their own lives. What does it mean to belong to a lineage that leaves no clear trace? Population Y is not a people we can name in the traditional sense. There is no record of their language, no artifact that can be held and recognized as theirs alone, no site that can be excavated to reveal the pattern of their daily existence. And yet, they were here. Not in theory, not as a possibility, but as a presence encoded in the biology of those who followed. It is a strange kind of existence, to travel perhaps over immense distances, to cross landscapes that no longer exist in the same form, to adapt, to survive, to become part of a new world, and then, gradually, to disappear as a distinct identity, to be absorbed, replaced, or diminished until nothing remains but a faint divergence in a sequence of DNA, a single percentage point, a marginal signal. Enough to be detected, not enough to be fully understood. This is the paradox at the center of paleogenomics. The deeper we look into the past, the more we encounter not clarity, but complexity. Lineages split and merge, populations expand and vanish. The boundaries we draw between groups become less certain, more permeable. In this shifting landscape, the idea of a single origin begins to feel less like a conclusion and more like a simplification. Beringia remains central. The evidence for migration across that land bridge is extensive and robust. It is not discarded, but it may no longer be sufficient to explain every detail. The Great Wall of History, built from decades of research, does not collapse. It develops fractures, openings through which new possibilities can be glimpsed. Some scientists remain cautious. They point to the limitations of the data, the difficulty of working with degraded ancient DNA, the ever-present risk of contamination, the challenge of distinguishing between deep shared ancestry and more recent gene flow. These concerns are not trivial. They are, in fact, essential, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary care. And the idea that a previously unknown population contributed to the ancestry of the first Americans is, by any measure, extraordinary. Others, however, see in the data something that cannot be ignored, a pattern that persists despite scrutiny, a signal that aligns across multiple independent lines of evidence. They do not claim certainty, but they recognize significance, and so the debate continues not as a confrontation, but as an ongoing process of refinement, a conversation between evidence and interpretation, between what is known and what is possible. In the midst of this, the ghost remains, not as a figure of myth, but as a scientific reality, a lineage inferred from the absence of direct evidence, a presence that can be measured, but not fully described. It is tempting to imagine them, to reconstruct a narrative that fills the gaps, a small group moving along a coastline or crossing through landscapes now submerged beneath rising seas, a meeting with other populations, an exchange of genes, of knowledge, of ways of living. But imagination, however careful, cannot replace evidence. And the evidence in this case is fragmentary. By around 9,000 years ago, the genetic landscape of South America appears to shift. Earlier variations fade. The dominant lineages, those associated with the primary migration through Beringia, become increasingly prevalent. The subtle traces of other ancestries diminish, diluted within a growing population. It is not a sudden disappearance, more a gradual erasure, a merging that leaves no clear boundary between what was and what became. In time, the distinct identity of population Y, if it ever existed as such, is lost entirely. Not through extinction in a dramatic sense, but through integration, through the quiet process by which one lineage becomes part of another. Their legacy is not visible in tools or structures. It is carried instead within people, within the Surui, the Caritiana, small communities in the Amazon whose genetic inheritance preserves a memory that the landscape itself does not reveal, a memory that is incomplete, a memory that cannot speak. And so we return finally to the laboratory, to the quiet hum of machines, to the glow of a screen in the early hours of the morning, to the researcher still looking at that line of code. It has not changed. It will not change. It exists as it always has, waiting to be interpreted. There is a temptation in moments like this to seek resolution, to draw a conclusion that restores order to the narrative, to explain the anomaly in a way that allows the broader structure to remain intact. But some discoveries resist resolution. They remain at the edge of understanding, not because they are errors, but because they reveal the limits of what can be known. The first people to enter the Americas may not have been a single group. They may not have shared a single origin or a single path. Among them may have been individuals whose lineage diverged long before their arrival, whose genetic signature now survives only as a faint echo. We may never find their tools. We may never identify their settlements. We may never reconstruct their faces with certainty. All that remains is the trace, a fragment of DNA in a long-buried bone, a quiet anomaly in a silent laboratory, and the possibility that the earliest chapters of human history in the Americas were written by people we will never truly see.